Well, welcome everybody to another episode of the Art Business Podcast. It's been several weeks because I've been very busy delivering the valuation section of our MA Art Business Unit. I'm Programme Director of the MA Art Business in London. My name's Dr. David Bellingham, and my guest today is significantly an alumna from the MA Art Business Programme in London, Sotheby's Institute of Art. Shahane, you're very welcome. Shahane Hakobyan. Apologies for the pronunciation. She studied the MA Art Business 10 years ago now, and in 2015 to 16. And her current role is developing a web platform that we're going to speak about in some detail called ARTanalyst. So, Shahane, for listeners who may be meeting you for the first time, because a lot of my students met you yesterday because you did a lecture about your web platform for the valuation series, how would you introduce the work you do today?
Well, hello, firstly, and happy to be here on this podcast. Currently, I am the founder and CEO of ARTanalyst. So I'm leading the development of innovative AI-driven insights platform. So it's a platform that we're building for the larger art ecosystem, though we're beginning the initial concentration on galleries first. And the platform aims to act as the sort of intelligence layer of the art ecosystem. What we do is we connect fragmented data points across cultural, social, and market signals into one place to support stakeholders within the industry with smarter decision making, better understanding of their performance and opportunities, which can support a more sustainable kind of business and careers moving forward within the industry.
Excellent. And we'll dive a bit deeper into that as we go through. So talking first about your career journey, you've had a remarkably diverse career across studios, galleries, art fairs, consulting, and now tech. So looking back, what were the major stages that shaped your understanding of the art world?
I would say that probably the first stage that helped me the most was actually starting as an artist myself.
Hmm.
So not only did that bring me into a deeper understanding of art, but it also allowed me to see where artists were being positioned and the way that they were kind of walking into a market that for them was very blind. And definitely that initial feeling of sort of dissatisfaction as an artist myself of how come I don't really understand what's going on here led me, years later also was one of the driving forces of me wanting to do the masters in Sotheby's because not only me, but many artists around me had that same kind of feeling of, okay, we've done these degrees, we are artists, so to speak now, but how do we manage everything that's being kind of brought to us? How do we make sure that we're not doing the wrong thing? How do we understand other people's intentions with our kind of trajectory? And so I think I've kept that feeling with me across every position that I've had in the art world. And I think having that artist first perspective has really helped me because I've always gone back to what is it that we're doing in whichever kind of position I was that how does it impact the artist? And I think that immediate level of also respect for anyone who does become an artist professionally, because I even myself wasn't able to stick to it that long. I know what kind of, strength it takes to do that. And so I think that helped me to always be able to try to find something within an artist's practice that I could appreciate and ultimately love. Because I think that a lot of things that happen in our industry that lead to success, they come from this balance of passion and intention. And so I think that's been definitely a core part of my journey. And then, of course, professionally speaking, my positions at Art Dubai and at Galerie Kornfeld and their project space at 68 Projects shaped my understanding of the whole industry. So with Art Dubai, it was wonderful to actually be a part of a large organization. And that was the first time that I started to see all those dots connecting. So how different departments were building a whole fair, how, everything from logistics to communications to the sponsorship to VIPs was creating an environment where art could thrive. And even the fact that I was working in more of an emerging market was a fantastic leading kind of position for me to understand the importance of the different cultural perspectives and the importance of collaboration, and how I think the collaboration that I experienced in that region between the different players is something that I try to keep with me along the way, and is even a core part of what I'm trying to build now with ARTanalyst. A big part of what I want to create has to do with collaborating with others, bringing everybody kind of together into, hopefully a space where we can use one another's knowledge to create a more sustainable ecosystem for everybody involved.
Yes, and just to throw in something there about students who come on the MA Art Business Program, like yourself, who began as artists, and we have quite a few who've done studio art, UAL, etc., Central St Martin's, Goldsmiths sometimes. I've got two things to say. Very early days of MA Art Business in the early millennium, there was a student who had literally, he told me that me and my friends work in Brighton in shared studios. And we thought that doing this program on art business, because we're never taught that as artists, how to cope with the real world of business, that we want our art to be a career. So we all agreed that we would put a share into the fee and then pull our names out of a basket, pull a name out of a basket. And he said, my name came out. So here I am. And he went back and is still working very successfully in Brighton. And of course, the other thing to say that is historical, an anecdote that many listeners will know about Damien Hirst, when he was at Goldsmiths in the 80s, second half of the 1980s, apparently Goldsmiths was teaching a small module on the art market. And Hirst has referenced that to say that that's what basically made him realize he could market his own art and a group of fellow artists. And then, the rest is history, bringing Saatchi into an early exhibition, et cetera, et cetera. So you've already, I was going to ask you about art. You've already talked about artists and small galleries and the time at Art Dubai, where your work, you didn't say what your role was there. Maybe you could quickly tell the listeners what you were doing there. You spoke about it, but you didn't say what you were employed as.
Well, I actually started off with a kind of apprenticeship that they did for 3 months in the sponsorship department. And that was a very, I would even say, strategic move on my end. And even from back then, I think I was already thinking of things in that sense, because I wanted to understand really that kind of driver within the market. So where is the money coming from? Who are these companies that are interested in investing in art? What are they looking for? And that was incredible in terms of understanding also a lot of this like balancing act that happens within the industry. So you have different stakeholders, you have different people that you have to make happy in that situation, from the sponsor, what they're expecting the outcome to be from having, let's say, a special room or a booth inside of a fair, to the artists and galleries who agree that the artist is kind of in that booth. So it's really bringing that balance between two very different worlds and understanding how do you make that happen. But also it was a great indicator for me of what power this sort of social and cultural aspect have on the rest of the industry. So it mattered who saw the work. It mattered who was backing the work. And, being within this bank's collection, it makes a difference to an artist's career. And I think for me, it was great coming more from the creative side to go sort of deep into the other side of things. I was also incredibly lucky that I had a wonderful, the head of the sponsorship department, then Lauren Perra, she was coming from a background in law. And I would say that even in those 3 months, what I learned from her in terms of like work etiquette and attention to detail and all these things helped me along the way later on in my career.
That's really interesting. We often talk to our students about attitude being very important, something we can't teach, but we can get alumni like you in to come in and give some tips on how you behave with people. And also how, I think you said in conversation with me yesterday, it's very important when you go to a new nation, a new country, to do some research into how you behave with them, because they have different ways of doing business. So I think it's a really, really good tip. And I just wanted to tell to show listeners the extent of this experience in Art Dubai, because it is a fair that has over 100 galleries from 40 different nations across the world. So,
Sure.
you know,
And the statistic might be even larger at this stage. But what was wonderful about the fair, because later on, when I actually was working there full time, I moved into the exhibitions department, which of
yes,
course was then the perfect fit for me because it was really about, you know, being the first point of contact for the galleries, for their artists. And that experience, you know, especially because it was galleries and artists from all over the world, you're also immediately working with totally different kinds of practices, different, themes and information and context that they're tackling with their art. So that was incredible to be a part of. But also, again, you're understanding the sentiment of how people are viewing what you're bringing there. And Art Dubai did a fantastic job of balancing representation from the global south with bringing in international also perspectives. And I think that is one of the things that certain fairs like that do very well is not sort of forgetting about what they can do for the local and regional art scene, but also allowing that kind of merger of those different worlds to come together in one place.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and then later, as gallery director of Galerie Kornfeld, I assume that's in Berlin.
Mhm.
We could talk about that. You oversaw programming in a gallery, international fairs, major projects. So, what were the most important lessons you took from leading a commercial gallery, such as Galerie Kornfeld Berlin, at that scale?
Well, that was a really wonderful experience also because I was running two galleries at the time, in a sense, because Kornfeld had one main sort of more traditional gallery program, and then just across the street, they have a project space called 68 Projects. 68 Projects also had a residency program, though it wasn't the only way that we would organize exhibitions. But what I essentially was doing mostly for that gallery when I joined in, because I came in as the international director. So that was a big part of, I was kind of looking at what the gallery had done until then and understanding how we could potentially expand into new markets, but also take more advantage of the markets we were already kind of starting to put our foot down in. So at the time, we were working very early on when I started in the gallery on a huge commission, probably one of the largest projects I've ever worked on in China. And it was an 18-meter kinetic sculpture by one of the artists. Probably one of the greatest projects I've ever worked on because it was, the time it took to make such a project happen. You're working with lawyers and governments and contractors, engineers, and this is where also things like my background from Sotheby's, having done a sort of law module, was helpful because you have to consider also that, of course, everything goes in the end through a lawyer. But when you, from the gallery side, can already initially spot and see certain things that need to be flagged within a contract, that's a lot of time and money saved. So these like little things are really useful later on. But I think the great thing there was seeing how we could make that initial contact with the region expand into something more long term. So following sort of that big commission, we decided to apply to a fair in Shanghai. So we took the gallery to the fair. We had, of course, the artists where we already had interest from China, but we brought in a few other artists that we felt could work in that market. So there was definitely, there's this whole process of understanding which of the artists would that be and who could really benefit from that exposure. And actually, just a year later, COVID happened. So we never stepped foot in China again. But some of the collectors we met there on that one trip ended up supporting the gallery throughout also that very difficult time in COVID, because despite having met them kind of once there in China, they were repeat buyers. And so those few repeat buyers from that one trip were much more valuable in a way to the gallery than from, let's say, a more regional fair that we had done. And I think this is the kind of value kind of chain also long term that I try to look into with my platform, is really understanding what it means to engage with a new place. We also made lots of great contacts with local galleries, local advisors. And so in the end, it was not only about what we were bringing to China, we also then invited some Chinese artists to our residency in Berlin. We did a few exhibitions at the project space. So there's also this cross-cultural, and of course that was an advantage that that gallery specifically had. But I think for me, that was a big thing that I took from it all was, okay, how do we make this one opportunity turn into several? So I think that long-term potential for revenue, things like this is like the things that started to click in my mind. And then also, how are we positioning the gallery? So trying to get the gallery into more major fairs was a big part of what I was doing. And a lot of the strategy there was about, because I had the experience being in an art fair, I was always in those rooms when the the committees were making decisions on which galleries are being accepted. So I already had a very strong sense of the criteria and the questions and what was being asked and what was being expected of the galleries and their applications. So having that ability to cater each application to position the gallery in the best foot forward and its artist was great. For example, the armory was a big thing that the gallery did. And the way that we got into the armory was because we did it with one of the curated sections. And we went bold. We took one artist, it was a video and sculptural piece, but it was a showstopper. And that presentation, although sales wise was very difficult, because also we were not a video centric gallery, but the press that we got, I don't think the galleries really had such great press as from that one participation. And that immediately placed the gallery and all of its artists with it in a totally different limelight. And that's sort of the importance there as well. So I think really being thoughtful about what one step can lead to later on is what I started to notice.
It's tremendous. So you're getting almost like observational research into international galleries at a fair, and then you work in one gallery and you're bringing that knowledge with you. And then almost serendipity, you made this link with China, and it just an externality happens, which is COVID. And luckily, those people, like many other players in the art world, are buying art online and they're remembering your gallery. And then you're getting their artists. And then you go to Armory, it's expanding the model. And then again, armory. It sounds as though I'm saying all this because I often say to my students, things happen in the art world that like I call it serendipity. They just happen. You might not have a job at one stage, but you're in some fair and you get talking to someone and they say, "Oh, you sound quite knowledgeable." Why? I did the MA Art Business Subject. Do you want to come for an interview? It happens all the time. And a lot of these things, I'm on one level, I'm afraid to say, are not really advertised, but very often they're not advertised because a small gallery doesn't even know that they would get value from employing someone new. That happens a lot.
Yeah.
So from that, what eventually led you to launch your own strategic advisory practice before moving fully into the tech space?
Well, firstly, it really started from a more practical place. So I had become a mother.
Congratulations.
Thank you. The most wonderful thing that ever happened to me, on a side note. But after my maternity leave, the gallery did want me to come back full time, which I understood for myself wasn't something that I was ready to do. And I think that's very important to also understand what is comfortable for you when you're working. And there is that balance of, ambition, but also like what's the best thing for you. So if I hadn't taken that step back, I definitely wouldn't have had the courage and even the mindset to think about, okay, let me create a construct which makes more sense for me, for my sort of life, for my structure that I'm in. So that was the initial kind of driving force. The other was this understanding that actually what I had done in the gallery was something that a lot of other people needed. This, maybe somebody a little bit disruptive coming in and questioning how everything had been done before, which isn't always easy. I mean, mind you, when I joined the gallery that I joined in as director, I was about 10 to 15 years younger than everybody, the only non-German and a woman. So it wasn't incredibly easy in the beginning to get to that point to be like, okay, what my view for this space is something valid and is something that can work. But once you start to implement things and people start to see changes, then it doesn't matter who you are as long as the change is happening. And then, yeah, so when I was doing my advisory, of course, I did a few traditional kind of jobs, But I really thought about, okay, what is business strategy for a gallery? What does it mean for an artist? How could I individually help artists in their trajectory? How could I help a collector with, better understanding the collection and its valuation? And that's more or less how it started, and mostly with getting back in touch also with people in my network and understanding what they needed and what they were looking for. And that's where it began.
Before we come on to pick up again the birth of ARTanalyst, I just wanted to ask a few questions which I think are interest listeners about your understanding of the art market at the moment, maybe into the future. I don't like using the word problems, but there are some issues in the art market. So firstly, you said before that the art market is one of the last major markets still built on intuition, personal relationships, and opacity, as opposed to transparency. When did that realization kind of like crystallize for you in your working life?
Mm. I think you have a sense for that from the very beginning when you're in the art industry. But I think the moment that I started to compare how we were doing things to how things were happening elsewhere was when I myself sort of left the industry for a moment. And the first time, doing something in hospitality and more a business side of things, and then trying to implement those strategies, those kind of skills into the more art space, I realized a lot of headway and I couldn't understand it. So I didn't understand the need to sort of reinvent the wheel every day. And I thought if we would just implement certain things that we know work and continuously do that in that form, actually we're giving a lot more space for freedom. We're giving a lot more space for thinking about art, talking about art. Why do we need to discuss logistics 20 times over? In that same amount of time, we could go have an extra coffee with one of our artists. That's much more valuable, I find. And I think that's where I started to initially see where we were falling back a little bit. And then for sure, when I first started ARTanalyst and I was finding myself in different environments and spaces with the tech world, and I was starting to see, especially from that world, the kind of openness to talk about things, to give feedback, to be, brutally honest. And it was funny because I said this to somebody during one of these sort of art tech events. And they said, well, just because they're wearing t-shirts, don't forget that these people are also sharks. And I thought that was quite funny. So I can't know to what extent my experience was completely truthful, but I definitely think that we're an industry that is constantly complaining also about the fact that more and more people aren't coming into it. Why don't we have more collectors? Why don't we have more people appreciating art, understanding art? But then we're not actually giving the world that opportunity to come into our world because we're saying, off the bat that we're different. So if the rest of the world is ready to implement technology, ready to implement change that's happening all around, and we're saying, no, but we're better than that. We're different. We run on a different kind of framework. We're immediately telling everyone that whatever you believe in, it doesn't belong here. And that's problematic, I think.
I think it's really interesting. I think it's the first time I heard it, put in that way, because typically you'll get a student who says, I'm really scared, David, of ringing the bell on a gallery in Mayfair, by appointment only. And I'm saying, no, just, you just develop the confidence, just, you believe in yourself. But there is still that kind of barrier there. It's even like when we go into the auction house and students often say, we were in Sotheby's the other day. The students who haven't been there before, there's always a few, they say, I couldn't believe how friendly everyone was, from the guy at the door to the cafe and, the specialists. So,
If I just may on that point, I think taking certain risks as a student or someone who's kind of starting in the industry is very important.
Yeah.
I didn't get my job in Art Dubai because I applied to it.
Yes.
I got that job in Art Dubai because, in a way, I was lucky that I happened to be in Dubai in that short period before I was graduating from my master's here. And I had no idea what I was going to do. I had applied for the job on the last day of the application. It was kind of like, oh, look, there's an opening here. I'm going to apply for it. But I also realized that I'm here for one day. What am I doing? So I got into a cab and I drove to their office. I knew the name of the person who was the head of the department, and it's a large building, and there's, someone at the security downstairs. And I said, "Oh, look, I've got a meeting with Lauren." I didn't have a meeting. And they said, "Okay, here's your badge." And I went upstairs and there was a nice girl at the reception. And I said, "Look, honestly, I don't have this meeting, but if she'll see me, I'd love to talk to her for a few minutes." Because I knew that that was one chance only. And probably, maybe even more than my CV, what made her in the end want to call me back for that apprenticeship was that I had immediately shown her that I was ready to do something a little bit risky and out of the box to make it happen. And so I had that meeting, I left Dubai, and a week later I got the offer to come back for the apprenticeship.
Wow, that's quite a story.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really scary, but it's also what I told the students yesterday. Just try, write to the person, call the person, go up and introduce yourself. And worst case scenario, you embarrass yourself a little bit.
Yeah.
Somebody's not the right person and that makes you feel uncomfortable, but it's not the end of the world. But if that opportunity solidifies the, that balance of, positive to negative outcome, it's really not, it's a non, it's not a question to me. I think just do it.
I was about to say not every boss is like Meryl Streep in Devil Wears Prada, but she would probably have actually been quite impressed by such a person at the same time. So someone can look really scary like a shark under the t-shirt, but actually they're quite impressed by another shark coming, or a potential.
Yeah. And in the end of the day, the truth is, I am actually somebody who is very conscious and afraid. I'm not always confident. Yeah. And it's not about being different to who you are. It's just about allowing yourself to sometimes take that step. So you don't always have to be a shark, but sometimes in life you do have to take an opportunity before waiting for it to come to you.
Yes, yes. And we've been talking this week with the students, including that you were involved in this, about, we're talking about valuing art and how you create estimates at auction houses and so on. And a lot of this is to do with personal instinct. But a lot of it increasingly, as in any industry, is to do with data. And I think it's finding a sort of balance between those two things. But maybe a question is, what are the consequences of the market relying so heavily on, traditional art market relying more heavily on personal instinct rather than the structured information?
Well, I would say that the main issue there is that you might miss an opportunity because no one individual or even, small company entity has the ability to see everything all at the same time. Absolutely. The other risk there is burnout. The other risk there is making decisions that maybe were not the right decision simply because you had to make a decision in that moment. And I think that's also fine. And more or less, the industry does work in that format. And not everyone does that. And, a lot of larger galleries are thinking more strategically, are employing also people coming from different backgrounds, for example. So some people have caught on to the fact that we might need to be doing things a little bit differently. But I'm really talking about, that group where they are really struggling and they do need something to change. And the point is that the thing that can happen is that we start losing a lot of good people. We start losing a lot of good galleries, a lot of good artists having representation, because the ones who will survive will probably be the ones who have the extra money to keep going, even if certain things go wrong. So of course, it's a wonderful idea to constantly just do things as you think instinctively make sense, but not everybody has that privilege. And so sometimes if you make one wrong decision with a fair, if that hits you really badly, it's going to be very hard to come out of that situation. And the ones who are really going to struggle there are going to be then the artists who aren't getting paid. And I don't see why that has to be the case. And I'm not saying that, for sure all of these like little implementations of strategy can solve everyone's problems, but definitely from my experience, these things add up to, they do add up to better sales. They do add up to more revenue. And that, comes back to the more revenue you have, the more opportunity you have to be more experimental with your program to make more opportunities for your artists. So in the end of the day, I think that's the main goal there.
Yeah. And we might speak later about, we're hearing this all over the world now, this notion of using AI and using data as an assistant rather than 100%. And we'd had these discussions. Students have written dissertations, obviously, recently about, will connoisseurship survive? Will our having a working knowledge and experience of looking at art as a human being, will that survive? And generally, at the moment, everyone's saying, yeah, it will. It's not going to. It's a bit like during COVID. Everyone thought the bricks and mortar galleries and auction houses would disappear, but they haven't, because as we know, art is a very social thing. People like going to openings of exhibitions, and sharing drinks, meeting the artists, meeting the collectors. So coming on to the birth of ARTanalyst, Shahane, you've described ARTanalyst as something you didn't set out to build initially. It emerged from trying to understand how value actually works. And for the listeners, and our students will know this, when we talk about value in the art market, we really mean not only financial value, but the cultural value that's related to that. Some call it symbolic value. Can you take us back to the moment the idea for ARTanalyst truly began?
Yeah. Well, actually, at the time I was working with one collection for a collector, and I was actually going through all of the steps that I had to reevaluate that collection, gathering all the information, gathering all the data, contextualizing the collection, looking at exactly what I was talking about, these fragmented points of information to be able to deliver one thing to one person. And I realized how much time was going into all of that. And I also thought to myself, there must be a way to kind of speed up this step so that I can get to the step that also I found much more interesting, which was the strategy part of it. So in a way, it came from that personal need, but also I was realizing that I was, only capable of doing one or two projects at a time, also as a mother. And to me, that wasn't sort of satisfying enough. I didn't feel like my impact was where I wanted it to be. And I think that was definitely a part of the drive for me was, how can I build a system that will make work easier for a larger amount of people and maybe actually make a change within the industry? So I think that was the driving moment for me to want to build ARTanalyst was, I'm doing something, but it's very small. And how can we make this bigger? And then I'm doing something that takes so much time, and how can I be more efficient? So those were kind of two things that was.
And also, as a parent, very often a parent will find it very useful to work from home, in inverted commas, So I guess the project that you were developing was something that still needed you to be out there as a lot, but you could actually work on from home as well, like developing the platform.
Exactly, yeah. And I mean, I work from an office, but it's 5 minutes away from my house, and it's 5 minutes away from my
Do you think
kids'
it's important
kindergarten.
to have that separate architectural space from your home life?
Personally, yes.
Yeah.
I know other people can do otherwise, but
Or have to.
yeah. But that was the first big investment I made into my project.
Yes.
Was making that decision to have an office space. So it's just a co-working space, but for me, that separation was needed.
Yes.
But then I think, as a parent, you probably know this, that when you have to better prioritize your time, you actually become much more efficient. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think was actually a wonderful thing to also realize, because then you're thinking about time totally differently.
Yes.
And which is where you start to realize how tools and things like this can be so useful. So
it kind of almost hones your ability to time manage. We discussed this to a certain extent, but I'd like you to kind of crystallize it in the answer. At what point did you realize that value in the art world needed to be understood in multiple dimensions? I've already said this: financial, cultural, but also social is another value that we might add to that duet.
I mean, I was already looking at value even during my time at Sotheby's, funnily enough. So I think I was always considering relationships. Maybe because I've stepped into different roles in the industry. So I've experienced, being the artist, being the gallerist, being the fair, manager. And because I've had that position switches, I've always known what the other side feels. And so I think that has been a big part of understanding the importance of the people around a system. So it's not only about the value of the piece of work, it's about the values of each individual who is connected in trying to create a structure around that artist. And that's where those three, social, cultural, financial value building is not only about the individual artworks. It's also about how do we build that framework, like I was saying with the gallery, how do you position the gallery? You know, a fair also positions itself in different ways. So we all kind of feed off of one another. A critic, a journal, everyone is kind of tiered in one way, in one sort of form, but then it becomes about finding those balances and being able to build on those values together.
I think it's really important, and I often would say this to my personal tutees on the program. Don't be afraid of. Someone asked me at Sotheby's the other day, one of the students, when we were taking them for valuation sessions, who are those people in the aprons with white gloves? I said, oh, we used to call them porters, but I suspect they're called technicians now. But I said they're very often people that have got a foot in the door of Sotheby's, and they're not necessarily privileged, but you wouldn't believe the number of people who are now standing on the auction platform as an auctioneer who started as a so-called porter. I remember my son spent some summers to make some money while he was during his education working at Sotheby's Greenford, the warehouse. And he now says that he had to work with all sorts of people, if you like. I don't want to insult anyone, but they were all great people. But he was working with people whose job was to literally take the forklift and carry the art. But he was also seeing clients coming to pick the art up. So he's really beginning to understand the relationships between social class as well. And I will often say to my students, please don't ever be a snob. You don't know who's walking into your gallery.
Yeah.
Very often it's an angel in disguise, and you don't know what they're going to buy. There's lots of stories of people walking. When Sotheby's New York was selling Garçon à la Pipe in the early millennium, which was then a world record price, apparently this guy walked in the back of the room during the bidding. Tobias Meyer used to be a very celebrity. He's an art collector, but he used to be a celebrity auctioneer. And this guy walks in the room and starts bidding. Everyone looks around. He's wearing dirty jeans, 3-day stubble. And it turns out that he was some kind of Russian oligarch with a lot of new money. So, anyway, little anecdotes like that you hear. So coming back to the ARTanalyst, what convinced you that KPIs and measurable indicators could be meaningfully applied to the primary art market? And just for listeners, the primary art market is where you buy a work of art for the first time, usually from a dealer or sometimes from the artists themselves.
Well, I think this goes back to what I just said in terms of, what we're measuring has to do also with performance. So it's also about your performance as an institution, your performance as a gallery. So the KPIs we're looking at is not only about, let's say, artist momentum, looking at the market, we're also looking at fair, ROI, exhibition ROI. So what were you spending? What is the sale turnover? Who are the people walking into the gallery for the exhibition? Who are the people talking about the exhibition when it's finished? So this was where I realized that by measuring things and creating a framework, you're also allowing yourself to, in a way, not forget, because there's a sense of things happen and then they're gone. So I think this incentive to measure is also a way of protecting and preserving also efforts. And that's something I think which is also this larger part of this burnout thing is I don't think a lot of people feel they get enough patted, on the shoulder when they're done with all of these events and things that they're doing. They fly from here to there and then before they can even celebrate, they're off to the next thing.
Yeah.
So I think measurement also has to do for me about keeping that energy, keeping that emotion, and being able to use that later on, because it's sort of also about this feedback loop. So if we can't measure, we can't learn from it in a sense.
It's really interesting. It's like an archiving of the more emotional, intangible experience that is never recorded. I was talking to a student just before we recorded this, a personal tutee thinking about dissertation. She wants to do something on auctions. In a nutshell, I said, why don't you are going to have to observe and put some time into it. It's very exciting. Observe, because it's never recorded what happens when a work of art is bid for at auction, but you can watch it and you can make notes. And then you can come to some conclusions if you watch enough of these auctions, and that can become in data that no one else has, because the auction house doesn't. The auction house actually does confidentially record who's bidding for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
They can find new clients, but they never publish that. Obviously, it's too confidential. But it's a similar thing that you're saying. Let's try and put this in a bottle. Put that experience of the art that was so good. If we could put that in a bottle and then drink a little bit of it before the next experience. So how did the idea of ARTanalyst evolve from a conceptual framework, if we can call it that, into like a real platform? And you might want to now tell the listeners basically in a nutshell what ARTanalyst is, what it's trying to do.
Well, I think what was really great about being able to develop it in what I think was the right way was the fact that I didn't try to build this on my own. So my first step, once I realized that this was something I wanted to take seriously, was I found an AI partner. So I reached out to a company who was already building AI and like data solutions within different industries. So mostly they were doing healthcare, education, but I also liked that because that specific company, they're called Social Lab, they were concentrated on AI for social good. So to me, it felt like a perfect fit because it was already, somebody who had a certain sensitivity to understanding different frameworks of value, actually, and impact. And the great thing was before we could go anywhere with, there was of course the initial pitch of the idea to the person and they loved the idea, but then to get to the next step, I had to break down what even is the art industry. How does that market move? What are the different players? So that was a very beginning kind of this like mapping the value indicators, mapping the whole ecosystem essentially to somebody who's not at all a part of that industry, but who's going to be crucial in turning all of that sort of theory into real engineered logic. And I think that was fantastic because then it wasn't just about two people kind of understanding a world and kind of like brushing surface over it and assuming that we knew what we were trying to get out of it. I really had to ensure that I fully understood a formula before he could create that formula. So that was a big part of like several months actually of really then building these KPI frameworks. So what actually institutes, what does momentum mean? How do you, when you get a signal, what is that signal? Why is something then successful, not successful? Why is there like we do different measurements based on the different data that we're looking at. So you're looking at maybe an index. And so if you're looking, for example, at measuring the fair, you have a certain percentage of that index is about the financial impact. A certain index of that fair is about visibility and positioning. A certain index is actually about leads, which can be future potential for profits. Meeting a person who you might collaborate with later on, things like this. So it was about understanding how do we create that index, who gets, what section gets what percentage, and then testing those logics with other professionals in the industry. So that was something I was also doing, was getting in touch with advisors, wealth managers, collectors, different people, and seeing if they kind of agreed more or less with these terms. And that's going to be definitely a large part of how we move forward with the system is over time, when testing with galleries, doing the beta, getting that information back of was that measurement really realistic to what they define as successful or not successful? And that's going to be quite a long, ongoing journey. I think that is essentially how that sort of process of building is going. So it's always about having this idea, creating a measurement for it, and then testing that logic, and then adjusting it, testing, adjusting. And I think that's essentially.
It's really interesting. And I would say to people that when you're a student, you're in a luxurious situation, because if you've got 3 to 4 months to research a dissertation, a gallerist is going to say, I'm really jealous that you have that time. I wish I had that time. Can I suggest, I've had students that have had that conversation and they say, it would be very valuable if you actually research this for us. And what you're saying is that it's a very important part, even when in a career, sometimes to step back and to look at the whole wood and not the little trees that you become engaged in. And that's what you were doing by looking at and you're also, it's very good for you to think, how would I explain this to someone who doesn't really understand the art world? How do I explain what's going on? I bet they loved it. I bet they
Oh,
loved,
they loved
I'm sure they found it
loved
very, very interesting.
yeah.
So
So
how, yeah, go on.
let me explain maybe like more step by step
Yeah,
also
yeah,
how it
no,
actually
absolutely.
works. So in terms of, so also about a part of that process was we had to build one demo. So we built first a large demo, which was looking into all of the potentials. So in terms of how data could be used by different people. So collectors, wealth managers, artists, galleries. And that first surveying step was also about understanding which of those users would benefit the most from something like this, and would they actually benefit from everything. So in that step, we understood that galleries would be the best case, like first case scenario. In one part, because they held the largest amount of primary market data. So if they're working with their own data, that's already something you can't get access to for others. So that's a very rich amount of information to work with. And besides that, galleries were telling us exactly what they wanted, which was something we hadn't even really thought about in the beginning, which was, an executive assistant. So they loved the idea of all this information, but actually they said, we want it to be even more simple. We want it to be very straightforward. So we had to understand, how can we make their, ROI of using a platform like this very quick and very straightforward. So what happens for the gallery when they're coming onto this platform? They first connect all of their data and their information. So you're connecting to their CRM, all their contacts, their exhibition history, all of their artists, their inventory, essentially everything that's happened with the gallery. You're also syncing calendars. So any calendar that they use, but also we're syncing external calendars such as art fair calendars that exist online, deadline calendars for applications that are coming up. So things that galleries, for example, are looking at all of the time, but it's already then ingested into your overall calendar in terms of also biennales that are happening, gallery weekends that are happening, and you can kind of click and choose what you want to have visible. But it allows your own activity to be reflected across what's also happening at the same time in other places, for example, in the market. So once your information is inputted, the next step is that the system ingests external data. So auction signals, press signals, social signals. So it's also looking at any time one of your artists is mentioned on social media. So we're really interested in any kind of information that can benefit you. We were also talking about this yesterday, also about compliance, things changing about taxation. So any kind of data point that could affect your decision making as a gallery. So once all those two kind of sets of data in terms of internal and external come together, the system is then cleaning it up and enriching this. And then with that, it finds within it patterns. It finds within it things that worked, things that are connected to each other. And then that information leads to a kind of insight. So then you can start to see, where is artist momentum happening? Where is their concentration in sales? Potentially, you see that actually 3 of your artists are keeping the rest of the whole gallery going, and that turns into a signal. And that gives you then an alert. But it doesn't stop there. It goes on to give you an action point. So there's very sort of practical action points. For example, you have a meeting coming up and it will say, the meeting's coming up, but then it'll prep you for the meeting. So the AI will do a little summary of the person you're meeting with, create talking points for you immediately, connect any artists or artworks that might be good for you to have at hand or to share with this person. If it's a collector, or maybe you're meeting with a museum director. So it just makes that whole thing faster and easier for you. On the other side, it's more like, if you're looking at artist momentum, if you get a signal that your artist is, their institutional reach or visibility is increasing, maybe it's a signal for you to consider that artist for a coming exhibition. Or if there's a decline in sales, reactivate their collectors. So the action that comes from that is a target list. So then it targets, based on all the information it's gathered, a specific list of collectors that you need to get back in touch with. And that's sort of these, like, it's not just about bombarding people with graphs and data they can't understand. Actually, what happens in the back, you don't even need to know. What you need is a simple sentence that says, you know, this is declining. Here's what you can do about it.
Yeah.
You want to do it? Press the button. Done.
Yeah. So you're not, because many of these kind of platforms just become overwhelming.
Yeah.
You have to do a lot of work yourself. Can you trust it? But what you'll present, and presumably this is coming from your own experience, but also probably a little bit of market research of what the galleries want. They're busy people. They recognize that machine learning and data driven business and strategy is very useful, but they don't want to be overwhelmed by loads of data. And presumably the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as we say, that the beta version would be testing, are these action points working?
Exactly.
If they work, then you've hit gold with this platform, I would say. But it does. I've seen it on the screen. You demonstrated it to me, and it also doesn't look. A lot of these platforms look overwhelming as well. Or how do you make sense of the data?
Yeah.
But it's quite straightforward and user friendly, I would say.
Yeah, and we're actually even simplifying more and more along the way. So that's definitely a big part of it is, tech complexity is an issue.
Yeah.
It's one of those pain points that galleries talk about.
Yes.
And so it doesn't help anybody if you create something that they don't know how to use. So it has to be one of the driving forces is creating something they want to use.
Mhm.
And this is where even, I had one gallery tell me something I thought was quite cute. They said, well, what if I sign in? Why doesn't it just tell me I'm doing a really great job? You know? So even just like a little pop-up message that says,
Well done.
well done.
Why not?
And I thought
Yeah.
it was such a funny, sweet little thing. And
Yeah.
I thought, yeah, maybe that's actually all you really need.
Yeah, or the confetti.
Yeah.
It's a great idea. Because obviously, the more that we're beginning to realize that AI can become a kind of PA, a personal assistant to us, if we use it properly and prompt it properly, it also becomes someone that almost with a human touch that will say, "This, you've hit the targets."
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah, we have to also understand how things are changing and how the next generation is also looking at AI. I went to a very interesting conference when I was in one of these sort of more tech AI summits. And they were talking about, the kind of struggle as well with the new generation is when we talk about AI, we of course have a very clear understanding of this is something that's not human. But the speaker was saying, it's not how some of the younger generation talks about AI because a lot of these kids are also starting to use AI as their, personal therapists and try convincing this person that the AI doesn't feel something in return. So even our sense of our relationship to these tools is going to be changing very quickly.
Yeah. It sounds as well, if I may say, Shahana, that you're very much in the vanguard of this, as far as I can see in the art world. I mean, I haven't come across anyone who's realizing that actually this is about a complete ecosystem, not just about one area of that world. So just some more things to talk about in terms of maybe the future and ideas of entrepreneurship. So maybe the listeners might want to know that. So building a tech company in the art world presents its own unique challenges. So what has been the hardest and maybe most unexpected part of your journey so far in trying to create this tool?
I think probably the hardest has been to, I guess, take people away from fear.
Yeah.
So I think when you start talking about a lot of these things, my initial thought would be that people would very naturally be excited about something that's going to solve problems for them, which to a certain extent they are, which is how, a lot of these conversations happen very easily. But then the longer you speak to people, the more you realize how much they're afraid of. And it's not just AI they're afraid of. They're also just afraid of, losing their own control, losing their position, losing their sense of how our system has already been working in the past. So I think, funnily, I find a lot of people trying to always come back with, but what about this? But what about that? And I always have an answer. And then at some point, eventually they go, okay, maybe you're right. And I think, yes, maybe I am right. And I think that's been the biggest challenge is actually coming from this, like from our industry. However, simultaneously, it's also a challenge in terms of like fundraising when you're trying to, when you go into other industries like these, a lot of VCs are still just now trying to look at the cultural side of things as investable. This is slowly happening. I said this to you as well, with, for example, the music industry, because it's very scalable. And even though, I mean, we're a huge market, it's 56 billion, sales, 3 trillion asset class, but somehow people can't grasp onto it because they don't understand and they can't see how you can move across the ecosystem. And that's where a little bit of those challenges has been, is really showing that this is a platform and this is a system that today it will help galleries. Tomorrow, it will help collectors. In a couple of years, it will help institutions, and ultimately, it will help artists. So it is very scalable. It is something that can really make a change if it's done right. But the only way that it can be done the right way is if people start getting on board. So the more galleries take that risk, the more people start going, okay, maybe let me see what I can do with this, the better we as a company, for example, can learn what really is going to help you. So actually, my sort of call out would be, take that chance. Trust me. These same people who are telling me they're worried about information and data are the people who put everything that has to do with their business into ChatGPT. And I think if you're willing to put it into ChatGPT, let it be in the secure, space where somebody is actually running it who cares for nothing more than your success and for the safety of your data and your information. Because I'm not, Meta. I have nothing to gain from that. What I want is to actually create something that will make your life easier.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a question which I hadn't prepared you for, but I think you will have an answer for it. My son works in cybersecurity. I can understand that anyone contributing to this might say, how well protected is our data? Have your tech people thought about that?
Yeah, of course. And that's also why like one of the values that I say that I have in the company that I'm building, again, is because I have this very experienced tech partners behind me.
Mm-hmm.
So this is someone who has been working with data protection, who has been working with all of these kind of systems and knows it to the core.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to sort of pretend that I know all of the intricacies that go into that. I'm also in conversation with lots of AI lawyers, and there are people who are already, very much specializing in this field. And, there's some people who say, build and we'll take care of the problems later. I'm not one of those people. So I've, from very early on, and I think a big part of that was also going to these big tech conferences early on for me was very crucial, because I was hearing already a lot of the questions that were coming up about ethics, about, biases in data sets. There was a very interesting round table that was run by a museum director who was doing digital art. And they were coming from the global south, and they were saying, well, there's a big issue with the fact that we don't have that same amount of data from this region actually available online. So anyone who's even researching anything or looking at any signals, they're missing a whole part of the world from that signal. So that's something you have to be aware of. And that's, I think, also a part of what's been exciting for me about being in this tech side, has been understanding that it's not just about let's make everything digital for the sake of making it digital. There's also other benefits to all of that. There's the archiving, there's the continuation of stories, there's the continuation of history, that we now have the opportunity to allow people from all over the world to understand what's been happening, art historically, in places they would have never had that opportunity to experience. Of course, it's totally different to be able to go there and be there, but not everyone has that ability. So if we can digitalize much more of art and even like art communication, art, structures with more of the world, then I think that's only benefiting everybody involved.
So globalization is on our radar as well. So looking ahead, what would you say success looks like for ARTanalyst in the next 2 to 5 years, and what are you building towards? What would your ideal be?
I would say that the ideal for me would be to to get to the point where we have several users and to really then be able to jump into the next step of like network intelligence. So not only then being a platform that provides information for any one individual, sort of isolated in their place in the system, but to be a platform where the whole ecosystem can come together and maybe even becoming that safe space, that secure community where people can start to actually share information with each other, be connected. And success would be people coming back to me and saying, we actually used your tool and it made a difference for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the more you'll then get a snowball effect, hopefully. Galleries will talk to one another and say, this is, it keeps it confidential and it's really, really useful. So quick fire round. Are you ready for that? So what's one art world habit you wish we would all stop?
Too many. I guess probably maybe misinformation, but also just a bit more honesty. And just, not forgetting that actually art is such a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And remembering that and just keeping that sort of clarity and
art and artists are at the center of the world. So if we didn't have that, we wouldn't be doing this.
Exactly.
And people can forget that. I agree with you. What's one metric galleries should pay much more attention to?
I would say one metric they should pay.
Other than your platform.
I think just long-term overlook at something is something they should. So not just looking at metrics or numbers in that moment, but really making a practice of looking at things over time. Yeah.
What excites you on a personal level most about the intersection of AI and the arts right now?
I think what excites me most is the fact that it challenges us to rethink some of the things that we felt were sort of solidified and in place. So I think whatever it can or may eventually do for us, it's making us ask questions. And I think it's always important to ask ourselves, why are we doing what we're doing? Where are we going with this? And I think having a challenger like AI, what I experienced when I was most going into these more sort of tech environments was how incredibly human the people I was speaking to were coming across to me as. And I really thought for a second, I thought, is it because they're surrounded by technology all the time that when they actually interact with one another, they're so incredibly human? And so maybe actually all this technology can help us kind of come back a little bit to ourselves.
Oh, no, I agree with that. And which artwork, exhibition, or book has had a lasting influence on how you think? This is the difficult one because you've got lots of examples, but just whatever comes to your mind.
Well, I wouldn't, maybe not a specific work, but I would say the self-portraits of Schiele.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I know it's maybe a common artist,
I haven't heard Schiele mentioned before.
I mean, Schiele was my first love, my first art love. I was introduced to Schiele in high school, which was the first time in my life that I even thought about really doing something in art. So I didn't come from an art background. It wasn't something I was expecting for myself. But when I sort of met Schiele, his work, it really became this full circle because I tried to understand the work. I tried to understand his paintings, his drawings, and I tried to also understand him as a person. So I did a lot. That was the first time I really started to read about an artist, try to understand the world they were living in, the environment they were living in, the other people who were involved in. So I think Schiele was my first time being like, art is also not just something I'm looking at. It's also something coming from
how it fits into your ecosystem. So it's kind of informed what you're doing now, really. And interesting because he's not an easy artist.
No.
Art shouldn't be easy.
There's a lot of things there, which I think I look back to it now, and I sometimes question myself. Oh, should you have been really putting this artist at such a high pedestal? But it was naturally what happened to me at the time.
And it's like what you said about AI is challenging us to rethink things. I think looking at art, we should allow it to challenge and make us rethink things as well, the art itself. So what advice would you give to someone entering the art market today? I mean, I guess as a career.
Well, one thing I would definitely say looking back is have some fun, because I'm someone who, I really love this industry and I'm very passionate about art on many different levels. But I'm also a bit of I take everything very seriously, which I think is wonderful and it's been great for me. But what I learned for myself since I started my own advisory and also doing this project now is that I haven't enjoyed so many parts of what I experienced in the past fully, because I was so worried about in making sure that I was doing my best job, that actually some of the most wonderful things that have come out of the last, few years of my career have been in those moments where I've allowed myself to just be in the moment and enjoy. And I think that was a big thing that happened with becoming a mother. So if I was now going to a fair, those 3-4 days, I take full advantage of those 3-4 days.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. And I take in every experience, every conversation, every piece of work I get to see somewhere else.
Yes.
And so I think, take a step back, send that email tomorrow, but instead go for that dinner, go for those drinks. Just try to also enjoy what you're doing.
Don't worry about what mark you're going to get. Go to the visit.
Exactly.
Even though it's taking some of your essay writing time up. So, Shahane, thank you so much. And before we wrap up, where can listeners find you and learn more about ARTanalyst? And I could put a link, obviously, but maybe you could just verbally say this,
Yeah, I mean, the website is ARTanalyst.ai. You can easily find me. I'm very active on Instagram. My handle is just Shahane, so Shahane, which I think I was very lucky to have just my first name as a handle. On LinkedIn as well, Shahane Hakobyan Jurgensen. So do reach out and you'll be hearing more from me.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that we'll have another podcast in a couple of years to see how it's going. So finally, I'd just like to ask listeners, viewers, do hit the like button, as you hear so often on podcasts now. And, even subscribe if there's a subscription to my Art Business episodes. Thank you very much for listening. And Shahane, once again, thank you for being a great guest. I think hopefully this has been one of these moments for the listeners and for us where we are enjoying it, being in the art world. I certainly have enjoyed it. So thank you.